I'm sure we've all heard the famous rhyme in which the day of your birth dictates your character. Monday's child is fair of face, Tuesday's child is full of grace, Wednesday's child is full of woe, Thursday's child has far to go. Friday's child is loving and giving, Saturday's child works hard for a living, but the child that is born on the Sabbath day is bonny and blithe and good and gay. But there is far more of the world of pregnancy and birth folklore than this simple rhyme. What many of these beliefs and practices have in common is a desire to protect the baby. Some of them go further, trying to predict the future life of the baby and influence it for the better where possible. So how did people try to protect pregnant mothers and babies in the past? Let's find out in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host Icy Sedgwick. We are sliding into August and I'm a little bit annoyed at how fast this month is going. I was planning all these things I was going to do this month and it's all I can do just to do the usual things that I had. But anyway, side issue. So this month we are looking at what I'm calling the folklore of life stages. So it's basically the folklore that associates quite big milestones in your life. Now we've done loads on funerals and burials in the past, so I'm probably not going to cover that many of those things there. However, we're going to start off with pregnancy and childbirth, and then next week we're going to do childhood. The week after we're going to do weddings, and then the final week we're going to have a look at things to do with moving house, because it is obviously one of the most stressful things that you will ever do. So that's basically how this month is going to pan out. Now, this was also a request from Tracy T, as in she asked for pregnancy, childbirth and childhood, I think, or children. So I thought I'd split them into two separate episodes because, as you'll see from this episode, there's quite a lot to cover just for pregnancy and birth, to be honest. And yeah, so if you do want to make a request for something in future, then there is a request link below in the show notes. So please feel free to drop me a request there. We're going to move on with the episode now because I've been waffling too much. So we are, as I say, looking at the folklore of pregnancy and birth. So exactly how did people try to protect pregnant mothers and babies in the past? Let's find out. Now, I wanted to start off with childbirth deities, and most forms of mythology and pantheons and so on do have fertility goddesses, which aren't always necessarily the same thing. So trying to find specific childbirth deities I thought would be quite interesting. So in ancient Greece, childbirth fell under the protection of Artemis, which might seem like a bit of a strange choice at first because she was one of the virgin goddesses, yet she was actually born first out of her and her twin brother Apollo. So she did actually then help her mother Leto deliver Apollo, so she has got hands-on experience, so she's quite a safe pair of hands. And the ancient Greeks also had Aletheia, who was the goddess of childbirth and labour pains, and Hera, who was the goddess of women and marriage and would also help out with childbirth as well. The ancient Romans had Juno, goddess of marriage and childbirth, and Diana, goddess of childbirth and hunting. Sometimes both Diana and Juno are given Lucina as an epithet to denote their role as childbirth goddesses. And the Romans actually had a whole range of deities which covered birth and childhood, and they would actually cover everything from opening the baby's mouth for the first cry to prompting their first words and so on. So there's this entire group of deities just for this one specific life stage, but I thought that's like an episode in and of itself, so I thought I'd just mention them briefly there. There's also the goddess of childbirth in ancient Egypt, Taweret, and she had the body of a hippopotamus, the legs of a cat and the tail of a crocodile, and she essentially acted in a protective capacity to chase away demons, and evidence of her worship actually dates to 2600 BC. She is one of the older worshipped goddesses, and despite her quite ferocious appearance, it does seem by all accounts that she was incredibly popular. Now there are, as I say, other goddesses, including the fertility ones that sometimes presided over childbirth, but I just wanted to give you sort of a little bit of a taste of the deities available for childbirth. Now we're going to move on to protection for birthing mothers and newborns, because let's be honest, childbirth is a scary time even in the 21st century, and pregnancy leaves mothers vulnerable. Now, in 1800, the UK child mortality rate was 329 deaths per 1,000 births. Now, obviously, that's deaths under 5 years old, and it works out as around 1 in 3. By 2015, the rate had dropped to 5 deaths per 1,000 births. So obviously, you're going from 329 deaths per 1,000 to 5 deaths per 1,000. So clearly, there obviously are better advances in medical care and so on. But with a death rate of 1 in 3, you can see why people would turn to protective measures wherever possible. So in Germany, parents might draw 3 crosses on the door at the height of the newborn, and the child would then be safe from hexes once they'd outgrown the marks. And elsewhere, impending parents tried to keep evil from the birthing room, and they did so by standing an upside-down broom in front of the door or sticking a knife into the door, and either of these things would apparently deter evil. The knife I can sort of understand, particularly if it would be made from iron. That's a pretty common way of deterring evil anyway. Now, there isn't much folklore around childbirth itself, and I'm going to guess that's because it wasn't really deemed important enough to record. And there's the occasional use of herbalism and poultices and things to try and speed birth along, but that falls into the realm more of herbal medicine rather than folklore. But there is still evidence of protective rituals, and Protestants actually confiscated 2 girdles, a red one for Our Lady and a white one for Mary Magdalene, from a Bristol convent, and pregnant women would use these girdles to speed delivery and protect against evil. There is also another belief, which I think is fabulous, that the husband could relieve his wife's labour pains by wearing some of her clothes, and here the pains would apparently transfer through the garments. And then, of course, we have eagle stones. And this concept came from Pliny the Elder, and I think regular listeners will know what I think of Pliny the Elder. But he discussed the phenomenon of the Etites, and these are basically stones found in an eagle's nest. And people would place them into skins taken from sacrificed animals and then attach them to pregnant women or cattle. And essentially, they were believed to ensure that they carried their young to term. And if the stones weren't removed at the right time, birth actually couldn't take place. That's how powerful they thought they were. Now, the reason why they kind of cottoned onto these stones is because they were actually nodules of siderite or limonite, and they were hollow, but often contained grains of sand or loose clay. So if you shook them, they rattled, and people took that to mean that the stone was pregnant, hence their use in maternity care. Now, they did lose popularity by the end of the Anglo-Saxon era, but they had a weird resurgence during the Renaissance. And speaking of birds, there wasn't really anywhere else in the episode to put this, but I wanted to mention it anyway. The idea of storks bringing babies may have come from Northern Europe, according to Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud, because apparently storks nesting on roofs were regarded as a sign of good luck and family happiness, which might explain the belief. Now, then we're going to get into the realm of birth predictions. So this is where you can then predict something about the child based on the birth, or before the birth even. So there was one belief from ancient Greece that a baby boy would lie to the right of the womb, affecting that side of her body. And even in 1724, midwives were told to look out for swellings on the right to predict a boy. Mothers were also recommended to hang their wedding ring or a key from either a thread or one of their own hairs, and they were then to hang that over the bump to see which way it spun. Respondents couldn't agree whether anti-clockwise meant a boy or a girl, so I'm assuming that one might have been regionally dependent as to which direction meant which sex of child. Similar beliefs around the bump and how the baby kicks. So one belief records that a bump carried entirely at the front indicated a boy, where daughters caused bumps to the sides too. Others thought boys would kick harder than girls, but that they also kicked less often. Obviously, do bear in mind that these predictive things where people are trying to work out if they're having a boy or a girl obviously do come from earlier times and therefore still subscribe to the gender binary. Now, there is another prediction, and it was about the fact that the quality of sleep that an expectant mother got would dictate whether her child was a light or sound sleeper. Parents also believed that they could predict much about their child's future life from the way that they were actually born. Midwives claimed that a breech birth indicated a difficult child, since, and I quote, awkward born, awkward all their lives, end quote. Meanwhile, a baby born with its hands open indicated a generous temperament. Those born at midnight on a Friday or during chime hours could apparently see ghosts. Now, obviously, we've talked about the witching hour before, but chime hours do tend to vary depending on where you are. So in Suffolk, they were 8 p.m, 12 a.m, and 4 a.m, but in Sussex, they were 3, 6, 9, and 12 o'clock. And then you also have a thing around what time of day the baby was born, because this dictated the length of the child's life, and their lifespan apparently shortened the later they were born in the day. Obviously, I think we can all agree that beliefs like this are a little bit nonsense, but that particular one came from 1923, so I think things have moved on since then. Babies might also be born in the caul, which is obviously just in the birth membrane, and people believed that keeping the caul made them immune from drowning, and indeed there was actually a roaring trade in selling cauls, which transferred protection onto their new owner, and in 1799 one caul changed hands for 30 guineas. If a person lost their caul, they would then become a restless wanderer, and surprisingly owning a caul was also believed to pass on eloquence, making them a popular buy in political circles. People would sometimes blame the mother for something to do with the child, and things like birthmarks were actually explained as being the mother's fault because she was said to have looked too hard at something or been frightened by it, and such a feeling was then believed to have been imprinted on the growing baby. So as an example, a nurse in Hendon reported that a child apparently had an aeroplane-shaped mole on its side, and the child's grandmother insisted it was because air raids had frightened the mother during pregnancy. Other ailments were explained by particular animals crossing the mother's path during pregnancy, and the mother also needed to take care not to let her baby look into a mirror before the baby reached a year old, because if the baby did so, they would grow up conceited. Some women were not allowed to touch scissors or knives while pregnant due to the taboo of touching iron, and I find that one quite a surprising one given the role of iron in guarding against fairies. But meanwhile, pregnant women were discouraged from taking certain actions in case it affected their baby. And this is a particularly horrible one, but MC Padden in 1921 relates a case in which a woman was told not to turn the handle of her sewing machine. If she did, the turning handle would cause the umbilical cord to twist around the baby's neck, which seems an incredibly macabre thing to tell a pregnant woman who's probably already quite anxious. So if you could get past all of this and you could actually get past the birth part, then there's a whole load of folklore about getting a good start for the baby. Midwives needed to raise the baby so that their first move after birth was upwards, and this would mean that they would then go up in the world. So the midwife would either carry the baby upstairs, or she might even just climb onto a stool. After this, the next important phase was actually dealing with the placenta, and according to Jacqueline Simpson and Steve Roud, the official rule in 20th century midwifery was to burn the placenta, and this was done either on the fire for a home birth or in a hospital incinerator. And according to one snippet of folklore, people thought that you could tell how many more children the woman would have by counting how many pops you heard while the placenta was burning. And this is a total side issue, but I thought it was quite interesting. A belief in 19th century Cheshire was that a man could gain the affections of any woman he wanted by burying a placenta at her home's threshold. And one man is actually on record as having tried, after paying 2 guineas for a placenta, although thankfully for the woman at least the charm failed. I thought that was quite interesting. But back to babies. You've probably heard the phrase wetting the baby's head, and this was actually done to bring the baby good luck in life. And in Cumberland, people would wash the baby's head in rum, and they would use gin in Suffolk. People in northern England followed an 18th century belief to bring the baby luck and wealth in life. So if the baby was taken to visit relatives or neighbours, the latter would give the baby bread, an egg and salt, and this would apparently bring them the things that they wanted in life. Nowadays, people will still give a silver coin to a baby they meet for the first time. And obviously babies often drop things when they're in their pram or whatever, and to find a shoe that was dropped by a baby was particularly lucky. And also having a baby poo on you was considered lucky. And I sort of think, did someone tell themselves that just to feel a little bit better? I don't know. And then also, if you were dressing your baby and you accidentally put the clothes on inside out, the baby would then receive a present within 7 days. A good-tempered person should be the first to kiss the baby because their influence would then rub off on the baby throughout life. And if you wrap the baby in an old shirt of its father, that would pass on strength. But you also shouldn't wash the baby too often or they'd wash away its health. Now, these are all beliefs from like the 20s, so they're obviously not exactly based on medical science. And there was also a belief in the planting of a tree at birth. And Virgil's parents were said to have planted a poplar, because as the tree grew, so their son's greatness was supposed to grow. Now indeed, in Switzerland, Germany, France, Italy, Russia and England, the practice actually involved planting a fruit tree, so tending that tree was believed to influence how well the child's life would turn out. It was also important to use a name for the baby that hadn't been used in advance. Somebody obviously hasn't told my family this because my parents are doing the family trees, and on my dad's side, there regularly seems to be like one particular person who just reuses a name when a child dies in infancy, like the next one gets the name, which I just find really weird, but that was obviously something you weren't supposed to do. And once the baby was born, they actually shouldn't leave the house until they were christened, and the mother couldn't even attend the christening if she hadn't been churched yet. Now, as for churching, this was an archaic practice that assumed childbirth polluted a woman, and she needed to be blessed by a priest after birth so that she could then rejoin society. And medieval women wore veils to church when they were blessed with holy water, and then they could take the veil off to show that they'd been churched. And people actually believed it was bad luck to meet a woman who left her house before being churched, although elsewhere and more recently, churching referred to a woman's first Sunday service after giving birth. And indeed, in East Anglia, people actually believed the neighbour would become pregnant within a year if a mother visited before being churched. And others believed that an outsider who helped with the washing after a baby was born would also become pregnant. So only those not of childbearing age would help out with the household washing around a birth. Now, the belief doesn't specify at what point others could come in to assist, so I'm assuming it stopped being an issue when the mother could return to her own washing. But finally, when we get to the christening itself, it was important that the baby cried when sprinkled with holy water during the christening, because this meant that the devil had been driven out. And if a lot of babies were baptised at once, the boys would go first. Now, we might look at these practices or superstitions and sneer, because they do often stand at odds with what we know from better medical care and improved assistance during birth. But people clung to these rituals as a way to protect pregnant mothers and babies at a time when they were most vulnerable. And indeed, is carrying a newborn upstairs to ensure that they go up in the world really any different from the length some parents go to when putting their children down for their chosen schools? Now, these superstitions basically take us to the end of the first few weeks or months of the baby's life. So next week, we're going to have a look at the folklore of childhood to sort of obviously take that on a little bit further. So if you aren't already subscribed to the podcast, then I recommend that you do that now. So I hope that you enjoyed this week's episode. Like I say, next week we're doing childhood, so that's going to have like lots of nursery rhymes and fun things like that in it. And as ever, if you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to show your appreciation, then you can make a one-time donation of buying me a coffee, which is a princely sum of £3. And it basically, you're not really buying us a coffee, you're actually just contributing to my book fund, because obviously the resources for these episodes do actually cost money, so it is obviously quite helpful. And as a well-known supermarket chain in the UK say, every little helps when it comes to putting together a lot of research for a podcast episode. And obviously just simply telling a friend is also a marvellous way to support the podcast, because it gets more people listening so that we can share in the community of folklore and so on. Incidentally, before I go, I'll say this one last thing. I asked a question on Twitter and also Instagram as well, and Facebook actually, now I think about it, asking people how they first got into folklore, like what first snagged their attention and drew them in. And on Twitter, it was the most glorious thread. Most of it was either family storytelling or libraries, which I thought was marvellous. But I am actually going to do like a short little mini episode on the kind of answers that people gave, so that we can all kind of sit and have a bit of a community enjoyment of folklore, and also how we all got into it as well. So I'll drop that at some point once I've actually collated all the answers across like 3 platforms. So that'll be really interesting to sort of see. So if you've got anything that particularly got you into folklore, feel free to tweet me. My Twitter handle's below. You can post on the specific post on my Facebook page, and the link to that is below, or you can also message me on Instagram as well. So if you want to get involved with that, then please do feel free to let me know what first got you interested in folklore. But that is now finally enough from me. I will let you get on with the rest of your day. Have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you next week when we do the folklore of childhood. Cheerio. Well, thank you for listening, and thanks for visiting Fabulous Folklore. I hope you enjoyed your stay. If you did, why not consider subscribing in your podcast app of choice? If you enjoy the show, why not leave me a review and help other listeners to find it as well? And if you'd like bonus exclusive episodes of the podcast, then why not support me on Patreon? It does help me to keep the show going, and it means that you get a little bit extra every month as well. And you can find all of the necessary links in the show notes below. So without any further ado, I will bid you adieu, and I hope that you have safe travels wherever you're going on to next.